But behind every fairy tale, there's often a lurking shadow. For Alexander, that shadow was the insatiable desire for more. More accolades, more wealth, more of everything that fed his relentless ambition. In his eyes, he was unstoppable. In Harriet's eyes, he was flawed, but hers to love. She believed her devotion and warmth could mitigate his hard edges, shaping him into a husband who could prioritize marriage as much as he did corporate conquests. Fate, however, had a different trajectory for the Carlyles. Harriet's younger sister, Charlotte Montgomery, re-entered their lives after a long stint in Barcelona, where she had been pursuing a career as a dancer and choreographer. She returned with stories of foreign lovers, smoky flamenco bars, and a free spirit that contrasted sharply with Harriet's poised reserve. In the beginning, Harriet found comfort in Charlotte's presence. She saw her younger sister as a burst of color in a refined, carefully curated existence. Alexander, too, was enchanted, though his fascination veered into dangerous territory. A whirlwind of secrecy, desire, and betrayal soon erupted beneath the surface of the Carlyle mansion, threatening to turn the family's world upside down. This is the story of how longing and ambition can collide, how the human heart can twist itself into unrecognizable shapes for the sake of love, and how hidden truths can unravel even the mightiest of empires. Beneath the glittering chandeliers and philanthropic galas, an unspeakable tragedy lay waiting. In the end, love would be tested, hearts would be broken, and destinies would be altered forever. Welcome to a world where illusions of perfection are shattered by the reality of choices and consequences. This is Alexander's and Harriet's story, but it is also Charlotte's, and it might be your story too, if you look close enough at the fragility of human desire. An unusual hush fell over the Carlyle mansion on the evening of Charlotte Montgomery's arrival. Typically, Harriet's staff bustled with activity maids arranging fresh floral bouquets, the chef experimenting with new amuse-bouche recipes, and the house manager ticking off a seemingly endless list of events on Harriet's schedule. But that night, everyone was on tenterhooks. Harriet was both excited and nervous for the return of her younger sister. "Darling, try to relax," Alexander said, slipping off his tailored grey suit jacket and laying it over the back of a velvet armchair. "This is your sister, not a troupe of paparazzi." Harriet forced a smile. "I know. It's just, I haven't seen Charlotte in nearly 3 years. She's been in Barcelona so long I'm not sure I even know her anymore." Alexander leaned in, kissing Harriet's temple. The warmth of his gesture soothed her momentarily. She often wondered what her life would be like if she hadn't met him at that charity gala in London. Still, she reminded herself she had no regrets. She loved him, flaws and all. When the doorbell finally chimed, Harriet nearly jumped out of her seat. She rushed to greet her sister. Charlotte arrived in a flurry of bohemian scarves, loose curls, and the intoxicating aroma of sandalwood perfume. The two sisters embraced. Harriet felt the same familiar closeness, but underlying that was a sense of strangeness. Charlotte was older, more sophisticated, and there was a restlessness in her eyes Harriet didn't recall. They chatted over dinner, in the mansion's opulent dining room, adorned with crystal chandeliers and Harriet's curated pieces of modern art. The conversation was lively, mostly dominated by Charlotte's tales of late-night flamenco dancing in hidden bars, her brushes with Spanish aristocracy, and the near-mystical energy of Barcelona's creative scene. Alexander listened intently, his gaze never wavering from Charlotte. He asked subtle questions that revealed more of her adventures, prodding her to share more details. Harriet was grateful for his interest, relieved that her husband was making an effort to make Charlotte feel at home. She had no inkling that beneath that polite interest was a spark beginning to flicker. As the evening wound down, Harriet walked Charlotte to the guest room. "You must be exhausted," she said softly. "Get some rest. We'll catch up more tomorrow." Charlotte smiled, her amber eyes glowing. "I can't believe you live like this," she teased, gesturing to the grandeur around them. "It's like something out of a movie. You married the billionaire prince, Harriet." "I suppose I did," Harriet responded, a faint blush warming her cheeks. "But you know, appearances can be misleading. Alexander works so hard I often feel like I'm playing a supporting role in his life." "You're his wife." "That's hardly a supporting role. Trust me, Harriet, you probably have more influence than you realize." Charlotte's words echoed down the marble corridor as Harriet made her way to the master suite. There was no way for Harriet to anticipate how those remarks would come to define the fragile dynamic that lay ahead. Somewhere in the shadows, fate like a waiting serpent was prepared to strike. A week after Charlotte's arrival, the Carlyle mansion was busier than ever. Harriet was finalizing details for the annual Carlyle Foundation Gala, an event raising funds for children's arts education. Alexander was juggling calls with financial institutions in Hong Kong and Berlin, negotiating deals that would expand his empire. Meanwhile, Charlotte roamed the estate's corridors, sipping coffee in the morning sunroom, practicing her dance routines on the wide marble floors, and occasionally slipping out to explore the city on her own. Their home was enormous, but Harriet couldn't fail to notice the faint electricity that seemed to crackle whenever Charlotte and Alexander were in the same room. At first, she chalked it up to Charlotte's magnetic personality. People were always drawn to her spirited enthusiasm, whether it was during a casual conversation or one of her passionate monologues about art and life. Alexander, for his part, had a tendency to connect with driven people. He found them intriguing. One afternoon, Harriet had to visit a local gallery to arrange a showcase for a young sculptor. She suggested Charlotte come along, but Charlotte was in the midst of refining a new dance piece and politely declined. With Harriet gone, the mansion was subdued, giving Alexander a rare moment of peace in his day. He was seated in his study, typing out an email to an investor, when he heard faint music echoing from the ballroom down the hall. He followed the sound, stepping inside to see Charlotte dancing alone. She wore loose black pants and a fitted top, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. The music was a vibrant flamenco guitar track, and Charlotte's movements were fluid, powerful, and mesmerizing. She didn't even notice him at first. She was lost in the moment, eyes closed, feet tapping in complex rhythms on the polished floor. Alexander couldn't look away. There was something elemental about her dance. Each twist of her hips, each sweep of her arm resonated with an undercurrent of raw emotion. When Charlotte opened her eyes and saw him, she started slightly. "Alexander, you startled me," she said, turning down the music on her small portable speaker. He smiled, hands sliding into the pockets of his tailored trousers. "That was extraordinary. I've never seen flamenco danced like that outside of Spain." Charlotte laughed, a light, airy sound. "You've been to Spain often?" He nodded. "I do business in Madrid now and then. I've visited some of Barcelona's dance halls. But you dance like it's part of your soul." There was a pause, a moment that hung in the still air. Charlotte seemed to sense a deeper note in Alexander's tone, something that felt like admiration, perhaps flirting. But she ignored the sensation and reached for a bottle of water. "Dance kept me sane, you know. When Harriet left for college in New York, I felt alone. We lost our parents young, and Harriet was always more of a parent to me than a sister. Dancing gave me a sense of identity. It saved me, in a way." Alexander took a step closer. "You talk about it with such passion. I admire that. People who truly love what they do tend to excel in their fields." Charlotte shrugged. "That's the plan. I want to start a dance studio one day, maybe even a small company." "Well," he said softly, "if you ever need a sponsor or any kind of backing, don't hesitate to ask." She blinked, momentarily taken aback by his generosity. "That's kind, Alexander, but I don't want you to think—" He held up a hand. "I insist. Your talent deserves to be recognized." The moment lingered, an unspoken tension layered beneath cordiality. Charlotte broke eye contact first, casting her gaze to the floor as if reorienting herself. There was an undeniable spark, something intangible hovering between them. but neither would dare articulate it or even fully acknowledge it yet. It was the first flicker of a flame that would soon rage out of control. It was 2 weeks before the gala, and Harriet's life revolved around planning every detail. She took calls from donors, selected table centerpieces, and vetted the catering menu. Despite the flurry of activity, she still felt a subtle knot of unease in her stomach. In recent days, she had occasionally noticed Charlotte and Alexander deep in conversation or even exchanging fleeting glances. She tried to brush off her growing paranoia, reminding herself that Charlotte was simply a captivating storyteller and Alexander was being the gracious host. One morning, Harriet found Charlotte reading by the pool, a novel by Paulo Coelho in one hand and an iced coffee in the other. She seemed so at peace under the bright sun that Harriet felt almost guilty, bringing up the hectic schedule of the gala. "Charlotte," Harriet began, settling into a poolside lounger, "I could really use an extra set of hands for the final planning stage of the gala. Are you up for some light administrative work? I wouldn't ask, but it feels like I'm drowning in details." Charlotte set her book aside. "Of course I'll help. Just tell me what you need." Harriet released a relieved sigh. "Wonderful. I have forms that need to be sent out to donors, seating charts to finalize, and the media kit to prepare. We also have a potential collaboration with Tracy Anderson. She's a real fitness guru, and she's rumored to be attending. I need to confirm and incorporate her schedule into the event timeline. Then there's the entertainment lineup. I was thinking of having a brief dance performance to open the gala. Would you be interested?" Charlotte's eyes lit up. "Really? That's a wonderful idea. I'd be honored. I could do a modern flamenco piece with a small ensemble. I'll contact some of my dancer friends." Harriet smiled warmly, feeling a surge of sisterly affection. That would be incredible. Let's make it happen. With Charlotte on board, Harriet felt the weight on her shoulders lessen. In the following days, the sisters worked side by side in Harriet's home office, finalizing guest lists, sifting through caterers' proposals, and refining the event schedule. In the quiet moments between phone calls, they laughed over childhood memories, like the time Charlotte tried to bake cookies for Harriet's birthday and ended up with a charred mess. Harriet felt closer to Charlotte than she had in years. What Harriet didn't know was that every so often Alexander would step in to check on progress. Each time, he'd linger a few moments longer than necessary. He might comment on the color scheme or the table decor, but his eyes often drifted to Charlotte, and sometimes their gazes met. Harriet was too busy to notice, yet something in Charlotte's posture would shift, her body tensing slightly, as if aware of the lines they were silently crossing. Still, Harriet pressed forward, delighted that the gala was shaping up to be a spectacular success. The Carlyle Foundation always garnered national media attention, and Harriet was determined this year would surpass all previous events. Funds raised from the gala would sponsor free art and dance workshops in underprivileged communities, a cause close to her heart. But the excitement of giving back to the community and immersing herself in charitable work blinded her to the undercurrent swirling in her own home. She would eventually look back on these weeks as the calm before a violent storm, a time when innocence and betrayal still balanced on a knife's edge. The push and pull between Alexander and Charlotte didn't erupt into a full-blown affair overnight. It began in the smallest, most innocent gestures that, in hindsight, formed a trail of breadcrumbs leading to an inevitable betrayal. A shared joke about Harriet's meticulous color coding of the gala spreadsheets, a passing comment about the brilliance of Spanish architecture, an accidental touch of hands when Charlotte reached for the sugar bowl during breakfast. Each encounter felt like a tiny spark landing on tinder. Alexander found himself uncharacteristically distracted during high-stakes meetings. He'd be on a conference call with a potential partner in Hong Kong, yet his mind drifted to the memory of Charlotte practicing her dance routine in the empty ballroom. There was a contrast between her vivacity and Harriet's more restrained, elegant demeanor, and that contrast both thrilled and unnerved him. For Charlotte, the attraction was equally unsettling. She admired Alexander's confidence and how he seemed to mold reality to fit his ambitions. One evening, while Harriet was out at a planning committee dinner, Charlotte found herself alone with Alexander in the living room. He was reading through some financial reports while she searched the channels for a movie. "Long day?" she asked, noticing the fatigue shadowing his face. He nodded. "Yes, but I can't complain. The results are worth it." Curious, Charlotte tilted her head. "What do you mean by worth it? The money? The recognition?" He closed the folder in his lap, giving her his full attention. "Money is part of it, but I like shaping the world in some small way. A new building in Berlin, a revitalized district in Chicago. My businesses don't just exist for profit, they transform places." Charlotte appreciated the depth in his answer. He wasn't just a shallow mogul chasing money, at least that's not how he saw himself. The conversation evolved into architecture, the role of art in public spaces, and their mutual desire to leave a mark that outlasted their lifetimes. The more they talked, the more they recognized a shared ethos, a hunger for meaning, for impact. But behind those words lay another hunger, unspoken and growing. After a few hours, Charlotte excused herself, heart pounding. She was more drawn to Alexander than she cared to admit. This was Harriet's husband, a boundary she swore she'd never cross. Yet some nights she found sleep elusive, replaying every look and word exchanged. She told herself it was a silly crush, a fleeting fascination. After all, Harriet was her beloved sister. Loyalty demanded she extinguish these feelings before they erupted into something catastrophic. Alexander, for his part, tried to rationalize his attraction. Harriet was an exceptional partner in so many ways. Why would he jeopardize that? Still, the forbidden angle, the very fact that Charlotte was Harriet's younger sister, fueled a taboo excitement he couldn't simply ignore. And so, the seeds of desire were sown in hushed rooms and stolen moments. They didn't fully sprout yet, but they had taken root. Soon, the demands of their hearts would outpace their moral restraint, sending them spiraling down a path from which there would be no easy return. At last, the Carlisle Foundation Gala arrived. The evening was a sparkling tapestry of glamour, from the black-tie dress code to the lavish decor that transformed the ballroom into a dreamscape of gold and ivory. Guests included notable philanthropists, celebrities, and high-profile bankers eager to show their support for arts education. Harriet glided through the crowd, radiant in a flowing emerald gown that perfectly complemented her red hair. Charlotte's performance was slated early in the evening. She wore a crimson flamenco dress that clung to her torso before flaring at the waist. Accompanied by 2 guitarists and a percussionist, she took the stage. Under the spotlight, her every movement conveyed a story of passion, heartbreak, and resilience. The audience was entranced, applauding thunderously when she finished. Harriet beamed from the front row, tears in her eyes. Alexander watched too, with an intensity that Harriet might have mistaken for admiration, but which Charlotte recognized as something more complex. When the performance ended, Harriet rushed to hug Charlotte backstage. "That was incredible! Everyone is talking about you," she whispered excitedly. Charlotte smiled, catching her breath. "I'm just glad it went smoothly. Thanks for giving me this opportunity." Harriet's eyes shone. "You deserve it, sister. Let's celebrate." She squeezed Charlotte's hands and hurried off to greet a group of donors who had just arrived. A little while later, after Harriet stepped away to handle gala logistics, Alexander approached Charlotte. His black tuxedo was impeccably tailored, exuding old-world charm. "You were mesmerizing," he said softly, handing her a glass of champagne. Charlotte felt warmth flood her cheeks. "Thank you. It's such an honor to perform for a cause that Harriet cares about so deeply." Alexander's gaze flickered to her lips. "You brought so much life to this event. I can see how passionate you are about dance. It suits you." She looked away, feeling the weight of the moment. "Dance is what I live for. But Harriet is the real hero here. She's organized this entire event, and look at the turnout." He nodded, glancing around. Harriet was on the far side of the room, engaged in conversation with an older couple from the philanthropic circuit. She looked regal, gracious, every bit the perfect hostess. "It was Harriet's vision," Alexander replied, "but you added a magic touch tonight." His voice dropped lower. "I know Harriet is the shining star, but you're remarkable, Charlotte." She swallowed hard, sensing the danger of letting herself bask in his praise. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." They shared a small, private smile that felt like a silent confession of their growing feelings. Charlotte excused herself quickly, heading to the bar for another drink, needing to steady her nerves. Alexander returned to greet more guests, but his mind lingered on the conversation with Charlotte and the unspoken electricity that passed between them. The rest of the gala was a whirlwind of speeches, auctions, and live entertainment. By the evening's end, they had raised a record sum for the foundation, enough to fund arts education programs across multiple underserved communities. Harriet was ecstatic, glowing with accomplishment. Photographers snapped pictures of her and Alexander in front of the Carlyle Foundation backdrop. They posed elegantly, Harriet leaning her head against his shoulder, their smiles genuine for the cameras. Yet when Harriet looked through those photos in the weeks that followed, she would notice something telling. In the background of one image, Charlotte stood off to the side, her eyes fixed on Alexander, and his gaze, though directed at the camera, held a tension that seemed to reach out across the distance between them. It was an invisible thread, an early thread of betrayal, woven right there in the midst of public celebration. It happened one late afternoon, 3 weeks after the gala, on a day so ordinary that it rendered the moment all the more shocking. Harriet had gone out of town for a weekend conference on art restoration in Chicago, leaving Alexander and Charlotte alone in the mansion. Charlotte was due to leave as well. She had a few leads on potential dance teaching gigs in the area, but her appointments were set for the following week. The day had started innocently. Charlotte was reading on the terrace, sipping green tea, when Alexander returned from the office earlier than usual. A project had wrapped ahead of schedule, and he found himself with an unexpected window of free time. He wandered out to the terrace, drawn by the warmth of the afternoon sun. "Where's Harriet?" he asked, noticing her absence. "Conference in Chicago," Charlotte answered, closing her book. "She left this morning." Alexander nodded, taking a seat on the cushioned chair beside her. They chatted for a while about harmless topics: the success of the gala, Harriet's new initiative to involve local schools in art workshops, and Charlotte's upcoming auditions. "We could celebrate," Alexander suggested suddenly, an idea lighting his eyes. "Your performance at the gala has led to so many opportunities. Let's open a bottle of wine, just you and me." Charlotte hesitated. She knew Harriet would not necessarily disapprove of them sharing a casual drink, but something about Alexander's invitation felt laced with undertones. Yet a part of her was tempted. She wanted to enjoy his company, to see if her own feelings were merely infatuation or something deeper. Against her better judgment, she agreed. They ended up in the kitchen, rummaging through the wine cellar Harriet meticulously curated. Charlotte chose a bottle of Ribera del Duero, a Spanish red with deep notes of black cherry and spice. They carried it back to the terrace, poured 2 glasses, and indulged in easy conversation that grew increasingly personal with each sip. Halfway through the second glass, the atmosphere shifted. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. Alexander leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You know, sometimes I feel like I've spent my entire life chasing an idea of success that was fed to me. In that chase, I might have lost parts of myself along the way," he confessed. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who usually spoke in terms of expansion and strategy. Charlotte listened, intrigued. "I think we all lose parts of ourselves as we grow, but we also find new pieces. The question is whether those new pieces are authentic or just placeholders for a dream we've outgrown." He reached out, fingers grazing hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, as if every nerve in her body had suddenly awakened. "I think you understand me better than most," he murmured. Charlotte swallowed, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the hush of evening enveloping them. Then, without preamble, Alexander leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a hesitant kiss. It was charged with pent-up longing and a sense of inevitability. Charlotte's mind spun. This was wrong. This was betrayal. This was Harriet's husband. And yet, for a brief, damning moment, she allowed herself to yield to the forbidden sensation. When they finally broke apart, their breaths ragged, Charlotte jumped to her feet. Her glass of wine toppled, splashing dark liquid across the stone tiles. I can't," she stammered, stepping back. Her heart pounded with guilt and desire. "This isn't right, Alexander." He looked up at her, half standing, his hand outstretched. "Charlotte, I'm sorry, but you can't deny I can," she said, her voice trembling. "And I will. Harriet is my sister. I love her." Tears formed in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She turned and hurried inside, leaving Alexander alone with the spilled wine and 1,000 regrets. For the rest of the night, Charlotte locked herself in her room, pacing, replaying the moment, and hating herself for the way she had momentarily surrendered. She didn't sleep. Guilt and shock coursed through her. She told herself this would be the end of it, that she would leave the mansion the next morning, find her own apartment, and distance herself from this dangerous entanglement. But fate had other plans. The line was already crossed, and once certain boundaries dissolve, it becomes nearly impossible to rebuild them without causing irreparable damage. The next morning, Charlotte intended to slip away before Alexander woke. She had hurriedly packed a suitcase, her mind set on finding a short-term rental near the dance studios she wanted to audition for. Anything to escape the confusion in her heart and the betrayal she had inflicted on Harriet. Unfortunately, Alexander was already up, sipping his usual black coffee in the kitchen. When she walked in, luggage in hand, their eyes locked. "Leaving?" he asked quietly. She nodded, setting her suitcase by the door. "I need some space." "Please don't try to stop me." He pressed his lips together, a mix of regret and yearning flickering in his gaze. "I understand. But Charlotte, about last night..." She held up a hand. "Don't. We both know it was a mistake. I can't stay here, Alexander. Harriet, she doesn't deserve this." He set his coffee mug down. "I agree. We need to think about what's best for Harriet, and for you." Charlotte's resolve faltered for a moment. She could sense a part of him that wanted her to stay, that was willing to risk it all for something intangible yet overpowering. A small, dangerous part of her wanted that too, but she fought the urge. "I'll call Harriet from my new place," she said. "Tell her I've decided to find my own space because I need to focus on my dance career and auditions. She'll understand, but I can't lie to her about this. It's eating me up inside." Alexander looked alarmed. "You can't tell her the truth, Charlotte. It would destroy her. We've already done enough damage." Charlotte faltered, tears brimming in her eyes. She loathed lying to Harriet, but to reveal this indiscretion might shatter their family. Still, the idea of covering it up felt equally disturbing. She recalled Harriet's face at the gala, so radiant, so proud of both Alexander and her little sister. Could she bear to see that light extinguished from Harriet's eyes? "I don't know," Charlotte whispered. "I need time to think." He slowly nodded. "If you need anything, financial support, help finding a place, anything, let me know. I want to make this right, if that's even possible." She managed a half smile. "I'll be fine. I just need space, Alexander. Please." With that, she picked up her suitcase and left, her heart pounding as she exited the Carlisle mansion. She found a small studio apartment a few miles away, modest enough to keep Harriet from suspecting Alexander had funded it. Charlotte had some savings and told Harriet via text that she wanted independence while she auditioned for various dance companies. Harriet, busy in Chicago, responded with a flurry of excited messages offering to help, though she expressed sadness about Charlotte leaving so abruptly. Charlotte wrote back that she'd explain everything once Harriet returned. The fragile pact between Alexander and Charlotte hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable. They had agreed to bury their mutual indiscretion, to pretend it never happened for Harriet's sake. But secrets have a way of festering, especially secrets born of love and betrayal. In the weeks that followed, neither Alexander nor Charlotte could fully move on. It was as if they had ignited a fire within themselves that no amount of distance could fully extinguish. While Charlotte tried to rebuild her life in her tiny new space, Alexander submerged himself in his work. He orchestrated deals, oversaw expansions, and jetted across continents. Yet he couldn't escape the memory of Charlotte's lips. Nor could he shake the guilt that gnawed at him each time Harriet lovingly asked about her sister, oblivious to the darkness lurking beneath their polished surface. And so, the silent agreement to maintain Harriet's happiness at all costs became both a shield and a sword, protecting her from the ugly truth while slicing into the hearts of those who guarded it. 2 weeks after her return from Chicago, Harriet finally found time to visit Charlotte's new apartment. She brought a bouquet of sunflowers, Charlotte's favorite, and a basket filled with fresh pastries from a local bakery. The building was modest, with chipped paint in the hallway and a faint smell of disinfectant. Charlotte opened the door, trying to mask her nervousness. Harriet's smile was warm, though tinged with curiosity. "This place is cozy," she said, stepping in. "You sure you don't want me to help with furniture? We have so much space at the mansion." Charlotte forced a laugh, gesturing at her sparse living area, just a futon couch, a bookshelf filled with dance manuals, and a small table that doubled as a dining and work surface. "I appreciate the offer, but I want this place to reflect me." Harriet nodded, setting down the pastries. "Understood. Independence is important." Charlotte's guilt surged. Harriet looked so pleased, so supportive. The conversation drifted to Harriet's conference in Chicago. She had successfully lobbied for an art restoration project to include local artists and students, furthering the philanthropic goals she championed. The more Harriet spoke about her achievements, the more Charlotte's stomach twisted. She wanted to confess, but the words lodged in her throat. Eventually, Harriet cast a glance at the bare white walls. "I was thinking," she said gently, "you've been so excited about dance. Maybe we can set up a small practice area here." Charlotte tried to smile. "Yes, that's the plan. I'm also auditioning for a local dance troupe next week." "That's wonderful," Harriet beamed. Then she grew serious, lowering her voice. "I hope you left the mansion for the right reasons. If there's anything you need, if something's bothering you, please tell me. I know I've been busy, but you can always confide in me." Charlotte's eyes brimmed with tears. She turned away, pretending to fuss with the pastries. "I'm okay," she managed, her voice wavering. "Really, Harriet, I just needed my own space." In that moment, Harriet reached out and embraced Charlotte. The sincerity of her love was undeniable. Charlotte found herself clinging to Harriet, torn between love for her sister and a desperate desire to keep the dark secret buried. Over the following days, Harriet often dropped by unannounced, bringing groceries, offering advice, and generally fussing over Charlotte like an older sister does. Charlotte, grateful yet suffocated by guilt, pulled away, focusing on her auditions. She didn't return Alexander's calls or messages, though he occasionally left her updates about philanthropic projects or new dance studios in the area. Meanwhile, Harriet noticed a slight tension in Alexander whenever she mentioned Charlotte. He would nod politely and shift the conversation to business. She assumed he might be disappointed that Charlotte had decided to move out so suddenly, especially after they had bonded over the gala performance. It never occurred to her there might be a far darker reason for his discomfort. And so life resumed a semblance of normalcy. Harriet, Alexander and Charlotte each tried to fulfill their roles: dutiful spouse, charitable socialite, ambitious dancer, while never acknowledging the secret that bound them all. But truth, like a caged animal, doesn't remain tame for long. Sooner or later, it breaks free, unleashing consequences none can escape. As the weeks passed, Harriet detected subtle changes in her marriage. Alexander grew more restless, working later hours and traveling more frequently. He claimed it was necessary due to the new expansion plans in Asia and Europe. Harriet, supportive as always, tried to be understanding. Yet at times she wondered if there was something else behind his distant behavior. During a rare evening when Alexander was home, Harriet prepared a quiet dinner, a simple pasta dish and a bottle of red wine. They sat in the modern dining room, the walls adorned with abstract art Harriet had collected over the years. "Are you sure you're not taking on too much?" Harriet asked gently, twirling her fork through the spaghetti. "You've already accomplished so much. Is there something you're chasing that I don't know about?" Alexander wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, avoiding her gaze. "I'm fine, Harriet, just ambitious. Sometimes I wonder if I'm living up to my own expectations." She reached out and placed a comforting hand on his. "You've built an empire, Alexander. You also run a foundation that's changing lives. You can slow down, you know." He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate the concern. It's just how I'm wired." Later that night, Harriet woke up to find his side of the bed empty. She padded downstairs, only to see him in the living room, staring at the dark fireplace. She approached softly. "Alexander?" He turned, startled. "Couldn't sleep." She nodded, resting a hand on his shoulder. He covered it with his own, though his gaze seemed far away. Harriet felt the chill of his detachment, but she couldn't pinpoint why it was there. She had no proof, no direct reason to suspect an affair, especially not with Charlotte, but she sensed an invisible wedge driving them apart. Meanwhile, Charlotte had landed a part-time spot in a contemporary dance company. She threw herself into rehearsals, trying to cleanse her mind of the memory of Alexander's kiss. Yet sometimes when she returned to her modest apartment in the evening, she found her thoughts drifting toward him. She hated herself for it. One afternoon, while she was stretching at the dance studio, she received a text from Harriet. "Can you come by for dinner next week? I miss you." Charlotte's first instinct was dread, but she couldn't keep avoiding Harriet forever. She agreed, her heart pounding at the thought of facing Alexander again. On the arranged evening, she arrived at the mansion, trembling slightly as she walked into the foyer. Harriet greeted her with a wide grin, hugging her tightly. Alexander emerged from his study, looking crisp in a navy shirt. Their eyes met in a brief exchange that Harriet didn't catch, but which spoke volumes: guilt, longing, fear. Through sheer willpower, they masked their feelings, sitting down to dinner in a swirl of polite conversation about the dance company and Harriet's latest philanthropic venture. Yet Harriet noticed something odd. Alexander seemed overly reserved, and Charlotte's laughter felt forced. Harriet looked from one to the other, feeling the tension crackling in the air. She couldn't put her finger on what was wrong, but a tiny voice inside her whispered, "They're hiding something." The thought unsettled her deeply. Harriet wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but she couldn't. Over the next few days, that suspicion grew like a hairline fracture in her mind, splintering her trust. Harriet began to wonder if her life, the one she had so carefully cultivated with Alexander, was not as secure as she believed. The stage was set for a reveal that would shake every foundation Harriet held dear. The only question was when and how those cracks would finally tear her world apart. Harriet's suspicions ate at her like a slow poison, compelling her to pay closer attention to details she would normally overlook. She noticed that Alexander's phone was locked with a more complex passcode than before. He answered certain calls behind closed doors, his tone hushed. Charlotte, too, had grown distant, declining invitations to visit the mansion or to go shopping activities they once enjoyed together. One afternoon, Harriet decided to visit Charlotte's dance studio unannounced, hoping to watch a rehearsal and spend some sisterly time afterward. She arrived to find the studio deserted. A janitor told her the dancers had finished hours earlier. Confused, Harriet wondered why Charlotte hadn't mentioned a schedule change. Feeling restless, Harriet drove back home, her mind swirling. She parked her car, walking into the foyer where a tall vase of lilies, her favorite flowers, stood as a centerpiece. They'd been delivered earlier as a surprise from Alexander, but Harriet was in no mood to appreciate the gesture. The house felt too quiet, an echo chamber for her anxious thoughts. She made her way to Alexander's study, searching for some sign of normalcy. The door was ajar. A stack of documents lay on the large mahogany desk. She hesitated before crossing the threshold, then noticed something half-hidden beneath a leather-bound folder, a slip of paper with Charlotte's name on it. Curiosity overcame caution. Harriet picked up the paper. It was a receipt from a high-end interior design store, listing items that sounded like furniture for a small space. A velvet chaise, decorative mirrors, and a specialized dance floor mat. At the bottom was a note scrawled in Alexander's handwriting, "Deliver to Charlotte's address ASAP." Harriet's heart pounded. Why was Alexander secretly buying furnishings for Charlotte's apartment? The question ignited a whirlwind of possibilities, none of them comforting. She quickly snapped a photo of the receipt with her phone and put the paper back where she'd found it. Her hand shook as she left the study. Panic rose in her chest, followed by a cold, steely resolve. She needed more information, something definitive. Harriet locked herself in the master bedroom, rummaging through her nightstand for the spare phone Alexander had given her in case of emergencies. She switched it on, remembering that it was linked to the same phone plan as Alexander's devices. Harriet had never invaded Alexander's privacy before, but suspicion can drive even the most ethical person to desperate measures. Within minutes, she navigated to the online phone bill portal, scanning for unusual call logs or messages. She spotted repeated calls and texts to an unrecognized number, spread out over weeks, sometimes late at night. Her heart hammered. She cross-referenced the phone bill with Charlotte's known number. It didn't match. Possibly a second line? She jotted down the unknown number and called it from her spare phone, her breath hitching when the voicemail answered. The recorded greeting was brief, but Harriet recognized her sister's voice. Charlotte had a second phone, and Alexander had been calling it often. Sick to her stomach, Harriet struggled to process the magnitude of her discovery. There could be an innocent explanation, but the evidence pointed towards something far more sinister, an affair. Harriet recalled Charlotte's tense behavior and Alexander's secretive demeanor, the receipt for interior decor, the hush in the air whenever she mentioned her sister. It all added up. That night, Harriet didn't sleep. She lay awake, her thoughts a relentless storm. The memory of her parents' tragic car accident haunted her. She and Charlotte had promised each other they'd always stick together after that loss. Harriet felt betrayed, not just by her husband, but by the one person she'd trusted above all others. She rose early the next morning, black circles under her eyes. She knew she needed proof that was indisputable. The next step would be the hardest, confronting her husband or her sister directly. But Harriet was too shattered to handle that just yet. She needed clarity. A moment to gather her strength before she unleashed the full weight of her discovery upon them both. Harriet spent the next few days conducting her own quiet investigation. She called Charlotte, calmly asking to meet. Charlotte gave vague excuses about a packed dance schedule, but Harriet insisted, her voice laced with a firmness that left no room for refusal. They met in a small cafe near Charlotte's apartment. Harriet arrived first, seating herself at a corner table where overhead lights cast a soft golden glow. She sipped on a latte, her nerves frayed. When Charlotte finally appeared, she looked fatigued, as though she'd been sleeping poorly. She offered Harriet a hug, which Harriet accepted stiffly. They sat, an unspoken tension between them. "How have you been?" Charlotte asked, forcing a smile. Harriet met her gaze, eyes unwavering. "I know about the furniture Alexander sent you, and the phone calls." Charlotte froze, color draining from her face. Her coffee cup rattled slightly in its saucer as she tried to steady herself. "Harriet, it's not what you think." "Then what is it?" Harriet demanded, her voice surprisingly calm. "You moved out so suddenly. You've barely visited. Alexander's been acting strange for weeks. And then I find out he's secretly buying you furniture and calling you on a second phone line?" "Explain that to me, Charlotte." Tears threatened to spill from Charlotte's eyes. She opened her mouth, words failing her. Harriet's composure cracked. "Just tell me the truth," she pleaded. "Don't make me dig further. I'm tired of secrets." Charlotte swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a whisper. "It happened once, just once. I swear, we kissed." Harriet flinched as though struck, tears pooling in her own eyes. "When?" Charlotte stared at the table, her throat tight. "After you left for Chicago. We drank wine together. It was a mistake. I moved out because I felt so guilty." "It hasn't happened again, Harriet. I promise." Harriet's lips trembled with rage and heartbreak. "Just once, you say? Then why the secret phone and all those calls?" Charlotte took a shuddering breath. "I got a second phone to separate my dance work from personal stuff. Alexander paid for some furniture because he felt guilty about the mess he dragged me into. He wanted to help me settle into my new place, but we haven't slept together, if that's what you're asking." Harriet's mind reeled. She wanted to believe her sister, but the trust she once held was shattered. "I have to ask you, do you love him?" Charlotte's eyes burned with emotion. "No, he's your husband, Harriet. I respect that. I just got caught up. I'm so sorry." Harriet shook her head slowly, her voice cracking. "I need time. This is too much." Without another word, Harriet stood, her chair scraping against the floor. She exited the cafe, leaving Charlotte at the table, tears streaming down her cheeks. Back at the mansion, Harriet confronted Alexander in the same study where she discovered the receipt. He initially denied everything, insisting he was just helping Charlotte financially. But Harriet's cold, tear-streaked fury forced him to admit to the kiss. "She's my sister," Harriet whispered, her voice aching. "How could you?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair, eyes downcast. "I don't have a good explanation. It was a moment of weakness. I swear I haven't touched her since. I regret it deeply." Harriet stared at him, as if seeing a stranger. The life she had built, the philanthropic events, the carefully curated home, the marriage she'd cherished, felt like a theatre set that could collapse at any second. "I need space," she said in a trembling voice. "Pack your things and go to the penthouse in the city. I can't look at you right now." Alexander opened his mouth to protest, but Harriet's tearful glare stopped him. He obeyed, grabbing some essentials and leaving in silence. Harriet was left standing alone in the foyer, feeling as though the entire world had just caved in. The facade of their perfect marriage lay in ruin, and nothing would ever be the same again. In the days following the confrontation, Harriet existed in a state of numbed sorrow. She cancelled her public appearances, citing illness, and avoided calls from friends. She refused to see Charlotte. Alexander remained at the penthouse in the city, bombarding her with texts, emails, and voicemails, all unanswered. Harriet spent her time wandering the mansion like a ghost, drifting past the gallery of photos that once captured her happiest moments with Alexander. Their wedding in Tuscany, their trip to the Maldives, the gala events that had seemed so glamorous. Each image felt like a mockery, now a reminder of a life she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. One afternoon, Harriet entered Alexander's study with a determined glint in her eyes. She began rummaging through the drawers, scanning documents, financial records, anything to see if there was more to the betrayal than a single kiss. She wanted to know if she had married a man who was capable of deeper deceit. In the bottom drawer, buried under several folders, she found a black notebook. Inside were scribbled notes about potential investments, philanthropic ideas, and mentions of Charlotte's dance ambitions. Harriet skimmed through pages detailing how Alexander planned to open a dance studio in Charlotte's name, write up business proposals, even have connections in the city's dance scene sponsor her. The dates indicated he had begun planning this weeks before the kiss. Harriet's stomach lurched, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. This wasn't a random moment of weakness. Alexander had been nurturing an emotional closeness to Charlotte for far longer than Harriet had realized. She felt a fresh wave of fury and devastation. That night, Harriet finally broke her silence. She called Alexander, her voice cold. "I found your notebook," she said simply. He exhaled, clearly shaken. "Harriet, please let me explain." She cut him off. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Alexander. You were seducing her with money and opportunities. Don't tell me it was just a fluke." Alexander paused. I was drawn to her ambition, her talent. I wanted to help her succeed. It got out of hand, but it wasn't a calculated plan to hurt you." Harriet let out a bitter laugh. "Yet it did hurt me, more than you can imagine." Silence stretched across the phone line until Harriet mustered the strength to continue. "I'm filing for separation. I can't handle this right now." Alexander pleaded, but Harriet ended the call. She realized she needed a lawyer. She needed clarity about the future of their marriage, their business dealings, and the Carlyle Foundation. The thought of dismantling everything they had built made her heart ache, but she couldn't see any other way forward. The following day, Harriet informed her staff that she and Alexander were taking time apart. She instructed them to keep it out of the press, at least for the moment. The philanthropic circles would soon start asking questions, but Harriet hoped to buy herself a bit more time to prepare for the inevitable fallout. Harriet also sent Charlotte a short message. "I'm done with both of you for now. Don't contact me." With that, she blocked Charlotte's number. It felt ruthless, but Harriet needed a clean break from the pain. Whether it was forever or just a temporary purge, she couldn't say. She only knew she had to do something, or the despair would consume her entirely. But grief and betrayal have a way of festering. Beneath Harriet's poised exterior brewed a storm, one that threatened to unleash a tragedy no one saw coming. The media got wind of Alexander's move to the penthouse in less than a week. Headlines speculated about marital strife, while gossip columns hinted at everything from creative differences to infidelity. Harriet, mortified, shut herself in the mansion, ignoring all but the most pressing communications from her lawyer and the foundation. Alexander found temporary refuge in high-stakes business deals, trying to outrun his guilt. He negotiated a lucrative venture in Dubai, hoping to distract himself from the life he had destroyed. Yet every night, in the silence of the penthouse, he was haunted by memories. Harriet's devastated face, Charlotte's tearful confession. Even his triumphs rang hollow. Charlotte's life was equally tumultuous. She tried throwing herself into dance, but the rumor mill within her circle was merciless. Whispers circulated that she had entangled herself with a wealthy benefactor in ways that went beyond mere patronage. She lost her part-time spot in the dance company, her director citing the negative press as a distraction. Her once bright future dimmed, overshadowed by scandal and regret. She attempted to call Harriet to knock on the mansion's gates, but Harriet's staff turned her away. Harriet, for her part, drifted into a deep melancholy. She felt profoundly alone, betrayed by the two people she loved most. Each day became a blur of half-eaten meals and tear-soaked pillows. She found herself wandering aimlessly through the mansion's rooms, pausing to stare at art pieces that once brought her joy. Now they only reminded her of the illusions of beauty and perfection, illusions that had been shattered. One night Harriet dreamed of her parents, remembering the day they died in that tragic car crash. She awoke gasping, tears streaming down her face, clutching at the sheets. She remembered how Charlotte had been her only solace in those dark days. They had promised never to betray each other. Now, that promise lay in ruins. Unable to sleep, Harriet walked downstairs, opened a bottle of expensive cognac, one usually reserved for guests or special occasions, and poured herself a tumbler. She drank in silence, letting the alcohol burn her throat, hoping it might dull the pain she felt within. By the time dawn broke, Harriet was still awake, eyes bloodshot, her mind churning with a toxic mix of heartbreak and anger. She thought about the Carlyle Foundation, the philanthropic events, everything she and Alexander had created together. It was so intertwined with their marriage, their shared vision. She had half a mind to dismantle it all, to see if the board could rebrand without the Carlyle name. But she worried about the children who benefited from the arts programs, the scholarships, the promising futures that hinged on the foundation's work. Somewhere in the haze of her despair, Harriet decided she needed to see Alexander one last time, to gauge whether there was any hope for reconciliation or closure. She called him, speaking in a tight, measured tone that revealed none of her internal chaos. "Meet me at the estate tomorrow night," she said. "We need to discuss our next steps." Alexander readily agreed, desperate for any communication. Harriet ended the call abruptly, unsure of what she wanted from the meeting: an apology, a confession, or maybe just the satisfaction of telling him she was done. She sat there for hours, swirling the remains of her cognac, waiting for a dawn that felt like it might never come. The following evening, Harriet waited in the living room, the lights dimmed to a low amber glow. The mansion felt eerily silent. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, giving her an austere air that contrasted with her usual polished elegance. Alexander arrived just after sunset, his face drawn. He held a bouquet of lilies, Harriet's favorites, but she simply stared at them before turning away. He set them on a side table, an offering rendered meaningless by the gravity of their situation. They sat opposite each other, Harriet on the plush sofa, Alexander on an armchair. For a moment, neither spoke. The tension was suffocating. Finally, Harriet drew a shaky breath. "I brought you here to understand why you did this. Were you unhappy with me? Did you think I wasn't enough?" Alexander bowed his head, struggling for words. "Harriet, you are everything I could have asked for in a partner. You're compassionate, intelligent, driven." "Then why?" she hissed, tears glistening in her eyes. "Why risk everything with my own sister?" He rubbed his temples, exhaling. "I don't have a good reason. Charlotte is vibrant, and she understood a side of me that I felt I'd lost. But I realize now it was a fantasy." Harriet stared at him, pain etched in every line of her face. "Is that supposed to comfort me? That my sister lit a spark in you?" Alexander shook his head. "No, I know it sounds shallow, but it was a moment of weakness, Harriet. I swear on my life I never meant to hurt you." Harriet's voice trembled with pent-up fury. "But you did hurt me, and Charlotte, and what about our future? What about everything we built?" Alexander stood, taking a tentative step towards her. "Harriet, I'm begging you. Let's try to fix this. I'll go to counseling. I'll do anything. I still love you." She rose as well, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I don't even know if I can believe that. Do you know how humiliating it is? Our marriage is under public scrutiny, and you put me in this position." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. A tear slid down her cheek, and in that tear lay years of devotion, shattered dreams, and heartbreak. "I'm filing for divorce. I spoke with my lawyer today." Alexander's face paled, eyes wide with desperation. "Please, Harriet, don't do this. Let's try separation first. Give me a chance." She shook her head, stepping back. "I don't see a path forward with you anymore." Just then the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the foyer. Both turned to see Charlotte standing there, breathless, tears streaking her face. She had managed to talk her way past the staff at the gate. "I'm sorry," Charlotte choked out, "but I can't watch our family destroy itself like this." Harriet trembled, a mix of rage and sorrow. "You have no right to be here." Charlotte rushed forward. "Please, Harriet, I'm sorry. We made a terrible mistake, but we can fix this together." Harriet's composure snapped. She unleashed a torrent of anger, screaming at Charlotte for her betrayal, for how she had violated the sanctity of their sisterhood. Charlotte sobbed, trying to hold Harriet's hands, but Harriet shoved her away. Alexander stepped in, trying to mediate. Chaos erupted, voices overlapping in grief and anger. None of them noticed the heavy marble statue on the side table near Harriet, a sleek piece Harriet had purchased at an art auction years ago. In the throes of her fury, Harriet swung her arm, inadvertently knocking it over. The statue crashed to the floor, shattering in a thunderous sound that seemed to echo through the hall. The violent cacophony broke the moment. Silence enveloped the trio, each suddenly aware of how far they'd fallen. Harriet sank to her knees, weeping, shards of marble scattered around her. Charlotte tried to comfort her, tears streaming down her own cheeks, while Alexander stood speechless, the gravity of what he'd done weighing on him like a physical chain. But the worst was yet to come. Fate had not yet delivered its final blow, and in the wake of shattered stone and shattered hearts, a tragedy loomed. That night, Harriet locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to speak to either Alexander or Charlotte. They both lingered in the hallway, trading anguished looks until they realized Harriet needed space. Eventually, Charlotte left in tears, and Alexander retreated to the penthouse. Alone in the vast emptiness of the mansion, Harriet roamed the corridors like a restless spirit, haunted by memories of happier times. When she passed the family portraits, her parents, long gone, and the younger versions of her and Charlotte, she felt a fresh wave of despair. She picked up her phone, scrolled through contact lists she could no longer trust, and finally called an old college friend to unload her heartache. But Harriet's friend was miles away, and Harriet felt no consolation in their words. She ended the call, perched on the edge of her bed, tears dripping onto the plush carpet. A suffocating sense of betrayal and loss grew until she felt as though she could barely breathe. Somewhere in the early hours of morning, Harriet made a decision both rash and heartbreaking. She downed half a bottle of sleeping pills, washing them down with whiskey she had taken from Alexander's personal stash. In her anguished state, it felt like the only escape from the crushing weight of betrayal, her sense of worth shattered by the two people she trusted most. Alexander woke that same morning with a hollow ache in his chest. He tried calling Harriet, but her phone went to voicemail. He texted Charlotte, who insisted they needed to find a way to help Harriet to ensure she was safe. A gnawing dread took hold. Alexander drove to the mansion, reaching the gates in record time, his heart pounding. The staff reported that Harriet had not emerged from her bedroom all night. Alexander raced upstairs, banging on the door. There was no answer. Fear clawed at his throat. He forced the lock, stumbling inside to find Harriet unconscious on the bed, an empty bottle of sleeping pills and a half-drunk whiskey bottle on the nightstand. Panic surged through him as he called for an ambulance. He cradled Harriet's limp form in his arms, tears streaming down his cheeks. Staff members rushed in, and soon paramedics arrived, loading Harriet onto a stretcher, her pulse weak, her breathing shallow. Charlotte arrived moments later, having received Alexander's frantic texts. She watched, horror-stricken, as Harriet was rushed into the ambulance. Without hesitation, she jumped in beside her, holding Harriet's cold hand. Alexander followed in his own car, unable to stop trembling as he navigated the streets toward the hospital. In the emergency room, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Harriet. Charlotte and Alexander hovered in the waiting area, united in grief and worry. Neither spoke. What words could they possibly exchange that would make this right? After an excruciating hour, a doctor emerged, his face somber. Harriet's condition was critical, but stable. They had pumped her stomach and placed her under heavy sedation. There was no guarantee she would fully recover. Charlotte collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Alexander paced, fists clenched, cursing himself for driving Harriet to such desperation. The corridors smelled of antiseptic, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, intensifying their sense of dread. Days passed in a blur. Harriet remained in a coma-like state, her vitals monitored around the clock. She was hooked up to an IV, a heart monitor beeping rhythmically. Charlotte rarely left her bedside, while Alexander dealt with the logistics, managing Harriet's medical bills, coordinating with the staff at the mansion, and fending off the media that had begun swirling around the story. In whispered conversations, Charlotte confessed to Alexander that she felt wholly responsible. Alexander, barely holding himself together, echoed the sentiment. Their reckless attraction had culminated in Harriet's heartbreak, pushing her to the brink. On the fifth day, Harriet's eyes finally fluttered open. She was disoriented, her body weak, her voice barely audible. Nurses rushed in, checking her vitals, alerting the doctors. Charlotte clung to Harriet's hand, and Alexander stood at the foot of the bed, tears in his eyes. Harriet stared at both of them, confusion etched on her pale face. "Harriet," Charlotte whispered, stroking her sister's hair. "You're okay. We're here." But Harriet's gaze remained distant. As her mind began to clear, sorrow washed over her features. She turned away from Charlotte, her lips trembling. Then she closed her eyes, as if willing herself not to exist in the same reality as her sister and her husband. Alexander stepped forward, voice breaking. "Harriet, I don't," she rasped, her throat raw. "Just don't." A nurse politely ushered them out, explaining that Harriet needed rest. Outside her room, Charlotte and Alexander stared at each other, devastated. They had nearly lost Harriet, and even though she was alive, the damage inflicted on her soul might be irreparable. That night, alone in a hospital hallway that smelled of despair, Alexander and Charlotte realized the magnitude of their wrongdoing. The price for their momentary lapse was more than they could ever have imagined. The question that lingered was, could any of them find redemption after such a tragedy? The weeks and months that followed felt like a slow crawl out of a pitch-black tunnel. Harriet remained in the hospital for a while, receiving not just physical care, but psychological support. Psychiatric evaluations, therapy sessions, and medications became part of her daily routine. The press and the public craved more details, hungry for scandal, but the Carlyle staff and Harriet's legal team worked tirelessly to maintain her privacy. Alexander temporarily stepped down from the helm of Carlyle Enterprises, citing personal reasons. He handed the reins to trusted executives, focusing instead on Harriet's recovery and his own therapy sessions. For a man who had once thrived on relentless ambition, this was a stark departure. Yet he recognized that his old life was no longer viable. Charlotte retreated into near seclusion, moving back to Barcelona in hopes of finding solace. She resumed dance classes there, working with an old mentor and trying to piece together her shattered sense of self. She wrote Harriet long letters of apology and concern, but Harriet never responded. Charlotte's guilt ran deep, and she saw no clear path to atonement. In time, Harriet's physical health stabilized. She returned to the mansion, though she had a nurse and a therapist on call. The corridors felt emptier without Alexander's presence. He had moved permanently to the penthouse, and Harriet found bittersweet comfort in that silence. She began painting again, an old hobby she had abandoned years ago as a way to process her grief. The act of layering colors on canvas became her therapy. Legally, Harriet filed for divorce, but the proceedings were amicable. It was clear that Harriet and Alexander were not in a position to fight ugly battles in court. They both wanted the Carlyle Foundation to remain intact. If anything, Harriet insisted on continuing to helm the charitable projects. Alexander, for his part, transferred significant shares of the foundation to Harriet, wanting to ensure she could guide its future without his interference. Within a year, Harriet had re-emerged as a prominent figure in the philanthropic world. The tragedy she endured, while never fully detailed in the press, added a depth to her advocacy that many found inspiring. She launched a mental health initiative in conjunction with arts education, citing her own experiences as evidence of the need for holistic support. Donors rallied behind her. They saw her resilience as a testament to the human spirit. At one particularly high-profile charity event, Harriet took the stage, wearing a simple yet elegant navy gown. She spoke about the importance of art in healing trauma, how creativity could serve as both expression and refuge. The crowd of dignitaries, socialites, and beneficiaries listened in rapt attention. As she concluded her speech, applause thundered through the grand ballroom. In the back stood Alexander, who had quietly attended to show his support. He watched Harriet with eyes full of remorse and a lingering love. After her speech, he approached her with cautious steps. She acknowledged him, offering a thin, polite smile. "How are you?" he asked softly. "I'm managing," she replied, studying his face, the lines of regret and the weight he carried. "How about you?" He shrugged, forcing a small smile. "I'm in therapy, trying to make sense of what happened. I'm sorry, Harriet. There isn't a day I don't wish I could undo the pain." She nodded, her throat tightening. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment, memories flickering in their minds, the good times, the betrayal, the tragedy. Alexander hesitated, then held out an envelope. "I've been meaning to give you this. It's just a letter, an apology, really, everything I couldn't say in person." Harriet took it, pressing it to her side. "Thank you." She walked away, leaving Alexander to his solitude. Later that night, Harriet opened the envelope in her private suite. The letter spoke of regrets, of his brokenness, of how Charlotte had been an escape from the mounting pressures in his life, but never truly replaced Harriet in his heart. It ended with a confession. He still loved her, but he respected that she needed to live her life free from his shadow. Harriet cried as she finished reading. The tears were not so much for Alexander as they were for the innocence she had lost, for the sister she no longer knew how to forgive, for the life that had crumbled before her eyes. But amid the tears, a flicker of acceptance arose, acceptance that the past could not be changed, only learned from. In Barcelona, Charlotte heard of Harriet's growing influence and her new mental health initiative. Tentatively, she sent Harriet another letter, describing her own personal journey of rebuilding her life, her vow to never again let fleeting desires upend the foundation of her relationships. She offered no excuses, only contrition, and enclosed a photograph from her latest performance, a piece dedicated to Harriet. Months passed before Harriet found the resolve to respond, writing a brief note that offered cautious hope. She wasn't ready to see Charlotte in person, but she thanked her for the dedication, acknowledging that healing was a process and that she was taking it one day at a time. Whether they could ever be close again remained an open question, one that only time could answer. In the end, life carried on. The Carlyle Foundation thrived, championing the arts and mental health causes that Harriet poured her soul into. Alexander maintained a lower profile, focusing on philanthropic investments rather than corporate expansions. Charlotte continued dancing, channeling her regret into profound, expressive pieces that resonated with audiences. The tragedy had left indelible scars on them all, but it also sparked profound transformations. In the quiet spaces of their separate lives, Harriet, Alexander, and Charlotte each discovered that resilience, connection, and authenticity often emerge most powerfully from the ashes of one's darkest moments. And so, in a world too often dazzled by the superficial glow of wealth and power, their story stood as a reminder: even the mightiest empires can crumble under the weight of human fragility, and sometimes, from the broken pieces, a more genuine, albeit scarred life can be born.